The rain fell softly outside Professor Jae-won Park's laboratory window at Seoul National University. It was almost midnight, but he couldn't leave yet. Something strange was happening with the raindrops, and he needed to understand what it was. Jae-won pushed his glasses up and looked through his special microscope again. The raindrops he had collected weren't behaving like normal water. Under the microscope's strong light, they showed tiny spots that seemed to bend time itself. When he moved his hand near them, he could feel a slight pull, as if the drops were trying to take his fingers somewhere else. "This is impossible," he said to himself, though he had checked his results 20 times already. His computer screens showed the same unusual patterns over and over. These weren't normal raindrops. They contained small areas where time moved differently. The professor walked to his window and watched more rain fall. The city lights of Seoul made the drops shine like tiny stars as they fell. He held up his hand and caught a few drops in a small glass dish. Under the microscope, these new drops showed the same strange patterns. Jae-won picked up his phone and called his research assistant. "Hey-yeon Lee." Even though it was late, she answered quickly. "Professor Park, is everything okay?" Hey-yeon asked, sounding worried. "Hey-yeon, I need you to come to the lab right away," Jae-won said. "I found something that changes everything we know about time and physics." While waiting for Hey-yeon, Jae-won wrote down everything he saw. The raindrops seemed to create tiny tunnels in time, microscopically small, but definitely real. Each drop contained what looked like a small window to another time, though he couldn't tell where or when these windows might lead. Hey-yeon arrived 30 minutes later, her coat wet from the rain. She hung it up to dry and quickly joined the professor at his workstation. "Look at this," Jae-won said, moving aside so she could see through the microscope. "Tell me what you see." Hey-yeon looked carefully through the lens. Her eyes widened as she saw the strange patterns in the raindrops. "Professor, the water. It's creating some kind of distortion, like little whirlpools in time." "Exactly," Jae-won said, excited that she could see it too. "These raindrops are special. They're forming only during this storm, and they contain what I think are temporal anomalies, small breaks in time itself." They spent the next few hours testing the raindrops in different ways. They measured them, photographed them, and tried to understand why they were different from normal rain. The storm outside grew stronger, making the windows shake with thunder. "We need to collect more samples," Jae-won said, looking at their results on his computer. "The effect seems stronger when the rain is heavier." Hey-yeon nodded and picked up some empty collection dishes. "I'll go up to the roof. We can get better samples there, away from the building's interference." "Be careful," Jae-won warned. "We don't know exactly what these temporal anomalies might do if they build up in large numbers." Hey-yeon smiled confidently. "Don't worry, Professor. I'll just collect the samples and come right back down." As she left the lab, Jae-won turned back to his computer, studying the strange patterns they had recorded. He didn't notice that the rain outside was falling even harder now, or that the temporal distortions in each drop were growing stronger. On the roof, Hey-yeon held out her collection dishes, watching them fill with the unusual rain. She didn't realize that she was standing in the perfect spot for something extraordinary to happen, a place where hundreds of these special raindrops would fall at exactly the same time. The discovery Jae-won Park had made that night would change everything. But neither he nor Hey-yeon knew just how much their lives were about to change, or how far this rainy night would take them, both in distance and in time. Hey-yeon stood on the university building's roof, holding her collection dishes in the heavy rain. The storm had grown stronger, and lightning flashed across the Seoul sky. She was already soaked, but she needed more samples for Professor Park's research. Suddenly, she noticed something strange about the rain around her. The drops seemed to glow with a faint blue light. She held up her hand, watching as the unusual raindrops landed on her palm. Each drop felt different from normal rain. They were warmer, and they seemed to tingle against her skin. "That's odd," she said to herself, taking out her phone to record what she was seeing. But before she could start recording, a bright flash of lightning lit up the entire sky. The rain began falling even harder, and the glowing drops started swirling around her like a tornado of blue light. Hei-yun tried to move, but her feet wouldn't respond. The world around her began to spin, and the familiar lights of Seoul started to fade away. She felt as if she was falling through a long tunnel, though her feet never left the ground. The air grew thick and heavy, making it hard to breathe. "Professor Park," she called out, but her voice seemed to disappear into the swirling rain. The spinning grew faster and faster until everything turned into a blur of colors and light. Then, as suddenly as it had started, everything stopped. Hei-yun found herself standing on solid ground, but it wasn't the university roof anymore. The modern buildings of Seoul were gone. Instead, she was standing in what looked like an old dirt road. The air smelled different, cleaner, but with strange scents she didn't recognize. The rain had stopped completely. She looked around, trying to understand what had happened. In front of her stood a large stone wall with wooden gates. Men in strange clothes, what looked like ancient Roman armor, were standing guard at the entrance. They were staring at her with wide eyes and raised spears. "This can't be real," Hei-yun whispered to herself. She looked down at her modern clothes. Her rain jacket was still dripping wet, but it seemed to shimmer strangely in the sunlight, creating rainbow patterns that she had never seen before. One of the guards stepped forward. He wore better armor than the others and carried himself like someone in charge. He spoke in a language Hei-yun didn't understand, but it sounded like Latin, the ancient language she had sometimes heard Professor Park mention. The guard, Marcus Flavius, was equally confused by the appearance of this strange woman. Her clothes seemed to glow with divine light, and she had appeared out of nowhere during a clear day. He had never seen anything like it in all his years guarding the fortress of Legentium. Hei-yun reached slowly into her pocket and pulled out her phone. It was still working, protected from the rain by its waterproof case. The date on the screen showed the correct year, 2024, but everything around her looked like it was from nearly 2,000 years ago. The guard captain spoke again, this time gesturing for her to follow him inside the fortress. Hei-yun hesitated, but she realized she had no choice. She needed help, and these people, despite their ancient appearance, weren't acting hostile. As she walked through the wooden gates, Hei-yun saw a busy Roman town spread out before her. People in togas and simple cloth clothes walked the streets. Soldiers patrolled the walls, and smoke rose from stone chimneys. She had somehow traveled back in time to what appeared to be Roman Britain, and she had no idea how to get back home. Her only hope was that Professor Park would figure out what had happened to her. Until then, she would have to find a way to survive in this ancient world, where everything she knew about modern life was useless. At least she still had her phone and her waterproof tablet in her backpack. If she was careful with their battery life, they might help her document everything she saw. The guard captain led her toward a large stone building in the center of the fort. Whatever was about to happen, Hei-yun knew her life would never be the same again. Marcus Flavius led Hei-yun through the fortress of Legentium to meet the garrison commander. The stone building they entered was cool and dim, lit by oil lamps that cast dancing shadows on the walls. Hei-yun noticed how the soldiers they passed would stop and stare at her rain jacket, which continued to shimmer with strange colors in the lamplight. The garrison commander, Lucius Severus, sat behind a wooden table covered in scrolls and maps. He was an older man with gray hair and keen eyes that studied Hei-yun carefully as she entered. Marcus spoke to him in Latin, gesturing toward Hei-yun's unusual clothing and making motions to show how she had appeared from nowhere. Hei-yun stood quietly, trying to remember anything she could about Roman customs from her history classes. She bowed slightly to show respect, which seemed to please the commander. He spoke to her in Latin, but when she shook her head to show she didn't understand, he tried several other languages. Greek, he asked in accented Greek, which Hei-yun recognized from her university studies. She nodded, remembering enough of the ancient language from her basic classics course to communicate simply. I come from far away, she said carefully in Greek, keeping her words basic. I mean no harm. The commander nodded, seeming relieved that they could communicate. He spoke again in Greek, pointing to her clothes. Your garments shine like the god's blessing. Are you a messenger from Olympus? Hei-yun thought quickly. She knew she shouldn't reveal the truth about time travel, but she needed their protection. I am a scholar, she replied, choosing her words carefully. I study the mysteries of nature. This answer seemed to satisfy the commander. He turned to Marcus and gave some orders in Latin. Marcus nodded and spoke to Hei-yun in Greek. You will stay with Claudia, the merchant's daughter. She speaks some Greek and can help you learn our ways. A young woman about Hei-yun's age was summoned to the building. Claudia had dark hair and friendly eyes, and she smiled warmly at Hei-yun. In simple Greek, she offered to show Hei-yun to her family's home. As they walked through the streets of Legentium, Hei-yun observed everything carefully. The roads were made of packed dirt and gravel, with deep ruts from cartwheels. Children played with wooden toys while women carried water from the central well. Soldiers patrolled the walls, and merchants sold their goods from wooden stalls. Claudia's home was a comfortable stone building near the market square. Her father was a successful merchant who traded with both Romans and local tribes. The family welcomed Hei-yun with a meal of bread, cheese, and watered wine. That evening, alone in the small room they had given her, Hei-yun took out her tablet and began to write about everything she had seen. She would need to be careful with her modern devices. The battery wouldn't last forever, and she couldn't risk anyone discovering them. From her window, she could see the fortress walls and the countryside beyond. The land looked so different from modern Castleford. There were no buildings outside the walls, only fields and forests stretching to the horizon. The sun was setting, painting the sky in colors that seemed more vivid without modern pollution. A knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. It was Claudia, bringing extra blankets and a curious smile. Tomorrow, Claudia said in careful Greek, I will show you our city. Perhaps you can tell me about your home. Hei-yun smiled and nodded. She had found a friend in this strange time, someone who could help her understand this world. She would need to be careful about what she revealed, but having an ally would make her situation less frightening. As night fell over Legentium, Hei-yun thought about Professor Park. Would he figure out what had happened to her? And more importantly, would he find a way to bring her back to her own time? Professor Jae-won Park had not left his laboratory for 3 days since Hei-yun's disappearance. Empty coffee cups littered his desk, and his computer screens displayed endless data about the temporal raindrops. He barely noticed when Dr. Ta-hyun Kim, another physics researcher, entered the laboratory. Professor Park, Ta-hyun said gently, you need to rest. We will find her. Jae-won shook his head, his eyes fixed on the microscope. Look at these readings, Ta-hyun. The temporal distortions in those raindrops were not random. They formed a pattern, and I missed it. I should have warned her. Ta-hyun moved closer to examine the data on the screens. He was younger than Jae-won, but he had earned respect for his brilliant work in theoretical physics. These numbers, he said, pointing to a graph, they show regular intervals. The temporal effects get stronger every 100 years. Jae-won straightened up, suddenly alert. Every 100 years. Show me your calculations. Together, they reviewed the data. The strange raindrops appeared only under specific weather conditions that occurred approximately once every century. The last recorded similar weather pattern had been in 1924, and before that, 1824. If we go backward, Ta-hyun said, typing quickly on the computer, and account for calendar changes. He stopped, his eyes wide. Professor, I think I know where Hei-yun went, or rather, when she went. Jae-won leaned forward to look at the screen. 79 CE, he whispered. Roman Britain. They worked through the night, analyzing weather patterns and historical records. They discovered that the temporal raindrops needed specific atmospheric conditions to form, a precise combination of temperature, humidity, and electromagnetic activity. "The next storm like this won't happen for another 100 years, Jaiwon said, his voice heavy with worry. "We need another way to reach her." Taehyun was quiet for a moment, thinking. Then he picked up one of the sealed containers holding the original rain samples. "What if we don't need a full storm? What if we could create the same conditions artificially?" They began building a new device in the laboratory. It looked like a complex weather chamber, filled with delicate sensors and atmospheric controls. They worked carefully, knowing they might have only one chance to get it right. As they worked, Jaiwon discovered something interesting about modern technology. When they sent test signals through their artificial temporal raindrops, digital data seemed to travel more easily through time than physical objects. "The quantum state of digital information is more stable across temporal distances," Taehyun explained, examining their results. "We might not be able to bring her back yet, but perhaps we can communicate with her." Jaiwon immediately began modifying their equipment. If they could send a signal to Taehyun's phone or tablet, they might be able to contact her. But they would need perfect timing and exact calculations. "The temporal window will be very small," Jaiwon said, making adjustments to their device. "We'll only have seconds to transmit any message." Outside the laboratory, Seoul continued its normal rhythm of life, unaware of the extraordinary experiments happening inside. The two scientists worked tirelessly, hoping to bridge a gap of nearly 2,000 years. "Hold on, Taehyun," Jaiwon whispered as he calibrated their communication device. "We're coming for you." 1 month had passed since Taehyun's arrival in Roman Britain. She sat in Claudia's garden, carefully writing in her tablet about daily life in Latium. The morning sun warmed her face as she documented everything she observed, knowing that every detail could be valuable to future historians. Her friendship with Claudia had grown stronger each day. The merchant's daughter had taught her proper Latin, and Taehyun now spoke it well enough to communicate with most people in the fortress. In return, Taehyun had shared her knowledge of mathematics, helping Claudia's father with his merchant calculations. The Romans had accepted her presence, believing her shimmering rain jacket was a sign of divine favor. She kept the jacket safely hidden now, along with her phone and tablet, only using them in private. The tablet's solar charging feature still worked perfectly, but she used it sparingly, saving its power for important observations. Today, Taehyun was helping the fortress engineers improve their water system. She had noticed that their aqueduct could work more efficiently with some small changes. Using her knowledge of basic physics, she suggested adjustments to the water flow that would prevent blockages during winter. "The water must flow at this angle," she explained to the chief engineer, drawing in the dirt with a stick. She was careful not to introduce any advanced concepts, only suggesting improvements they could have reasonably discovered themselves. The engineer nodded with approval. "The gods have truly blessed us with your wisdom," he said in Latin. Taehyun smiled politely, knowing she could not correct his assumption. Later that afternoon, she walked with Claudia through the marketplace. The familiar sounds and smells no longer seemed strange to her. The clang of the blacksmith's hammer, the aroma of fresh bread, the calls of merchants selling their goods. "You seem troubled today," Claudia said as they walked. "Do you miss your homeland?" Taehyun nodded, thinking of Seoul and Professor Park's laboratory. "Yes, but I am grateful for your family's kindness." That evening, alone in her room, Taehyun checked her devices again. The phone still showed no signal, but she kept it charged using the solar power from her tablet. Sometimes, late at night, she thought she saw strange patterns on the screen, like someone was trying to send her a message. She had started keeping 2 journals, one on paper, writing in Latin about normal daily activities, and another secret one on her tablet, recording everything she learned about Roman Britain. She was careful not to change anything significant in history, but she couldn't help making small improvements to people's lives when she could. Marcus Flavius, the guard who had first found her, often asked her advice about military matters. She kept her suggestions simple: better sanitation for the soldiers, improved food storage methods, basic medical care. Nothing that would dramatically change history, but enough to help people live better lives. As night fell over Legentium, Hei-yun stood at her window, looking at the stars. They were so much brighter here, without modern light pollution. She thought about Professor Park and wondered if he was trying to bring her back. Part of her wanted to return home, but another part had grown attached to this simpler life and the friends she had made. Her tablet suddenly lit up with an unusual pattern. Her heart raced as she picked it up. Could it be a message from the future? She watched the screen carefully, hope and anxiety mixing in her chest as she waited to see if Professor Park had found a way to reach across time. Professor Park and Dr. Kim worked steadily in their laboratory, surrounded by humming machines. Their new device, which they called the temporal rain interface, filled half the room. It created artificial rain with the same special properties as the drops that had taken Hei-yun away. "The signal is getting stronger," Ta-hyun said, watching the computer screens. "The temporal window will open in exactly 3 minutes. Jae-won checked their equipment one final time. They had discovered that they could send digital signals through time during brief moments when the temporal raindrops were most active. These moments happened during specific alignments of the Earth's magnetic field. The machine began to spray a fine mist of temporal rain. Each drop contained a tiny piece of their message, encoded in quantum states that could travel through time. They watched the countdown timer, hoping their calculations were correct. In Roman Britain, Hei-yun sat in her room, staring at her tablet's screen. The strange patterns she had seen earlier were becoming clearer. Numbers appeared, then letters. Her hands shook as she recognized the Korean characters forming on the screen. "Hei-yun, if you can read this, press the power button 3 times. The message read. She quickly pressed the button 3 times, her heart racing. The screen flickered, then showed new text. "Signal received. Are you safe? Press once for yes, twice for no." Hei-yun pressed the button once. Tears formed in her eyes as she realized she had finally made contact with her own time. Back in the laboratory, Jae-won and Ta-hyun celebrated when they received Hei-yun's response. Their device was working. The temporal rain had created a bridge between their times, even if only for short messages. "We can only maintain the connection for 2 minutes at a time," Ta-hyun explained, watching the power readings. "The next window will open in exactly 12 hours. They sent another message to Hei-yun, explaining how they would communicate. Each day, during the alignment of the magnetic field, they would have a brief chance to exchange messages. In Legentium, Hei-yun carefully hid her tablet after reading the final message. She now had a way to share her discoveries with the future, and more importantly, a chance to return home when the time was right. The next morning, she walked through the fortress with new energy. Claudia noticed her improved mood but didn't ask questions. The two women had developed a friendship built on trust and accepting each other's secrets. "The gods have blessed you with happy news," Claudia asked as they collected water from the well. Hei-yun smiled. "Yes, you could say that. I have heard from my homeland." That evening, she prepared for the next communication window. She had organized her notes and observations, ready to share important historical information with Professor Park. But she also had a warning to give them, something she had discovered about the fortress's future. As she waited for her tablet to show signs of the temporal connection, Hei-yun thought about how much had changed. She was no longer just a visitor from the future. She had become part of this community. The messages from Professor Park were a lifeline to her own time, but they also reminded her of the responsibility she carried. The tablet's screen began to glow with the familiar pattern of temporal rain. Hei-yun took a deep breath, ready to share what she had learned about the coming danger to Legentium. Hei-yun's tablet glowed in the darkness of her room as she prepared to send her urgent message to Professor Park. She had discovered something terrible while studying the local river patterns and reviewing the fortress's building plans. During her walks along the river, She had noticed signs that worried her. The water levels were rising steadily, and the soil near the fortress walls was becoming softer. Her knowledge of modern geology told her that a devastating flood was coming, one that would destroy much of Legentium. The tablet screen lit up with Professor Park's message. "Connection stable. What have you discovered?" Hei-yun's fingers moved quickly across the screen, typing her response. She explained about the river's changing patterns and the weakening ground beneath the fortress. According to her calculations, the flood would happen within the next month. In the modern laboratory, Professor Park and Dr. Kim read her message with growing concern. They quickly searched historical records, but found no mention of this flood. Either the records were lost, or something had changed the timeline. "We need to check if warning them would alter history too much," Ta-hyun said, looking through their historical data. Jae-won nodded gravely. "Hei-yun, please wait for our research before taking action," he typed back. But Hei-yun was already struggling with this decision. Earlier that day, she had watched children playing near the fortress walls. She had eaten dinner with Claudia's family and talked with Marcus about the fortress's future. These were real people, not just figures from history books. The next morning, Hei-yun walked through the fortress with new awareness. She saw pregnant women, elderly craftsmen, and young apprentices, all unaware of the danger approaching their home. She stopped at the fortress walls, watching workers repair small cracks that she now knew were signs of the coming disaster. That evening, another message arrived from Professor Park. "Historical records show Legentium continued to exist for centuries. The flood you predict is not documented. We cannot risk changing the timeline." Hei-yun sat in her room, tears falling on her tablet screen. She understood the importance of preserving history, but she also knew these people deserved a chance to survive. She thought about Claudia, who had become like a sister to her, and all the others who had welcomed her into their community. Making her decision, Hei-yun walked to the garrison commander's quarters. She would not warn them about the flood directly, but she could suggest strengthening the river walls as a precaution against the rainy season. "The river seems higher than usual," she said carefully to Commander Severus in Latin. "Perhaps we should reinforce the northern walls." The commander considered her words thoughtfully. He had learned to trust her suggestions, seeing how her previous advice had helped the fortress. "Show me where you think we need improvements," he said. As they walked along the walls, Hei-yun pointed out the weak spots, explaining her concerns in a way that wouldn't reveal her knowledge of the future. She hoped these small changes might save lives without dramatically altering history. That night, she wrote in her tablet, "I cannot stand by and watch people die when I can help them. Some things are more important than preserving every detail of history. I hope you understand." She waited anxiously for Professor Park's response, knowing her decision could change everything, including her chances of ever returning home. The rains came exactly as Hei-yun had predicted. Dark clouds gathered over Legentium, bringing the heaviest storms anyone could remember. But the fortress was prepared. The reinforced walls held strong against the rising water, and the new drainage systems she had helped design carried the excess water safely away from the settlement. Professor Park and Dr. Kim watched their temporal monitors with intense focus. The atmospheric conditions were almost identical to the night. Hei-yun had disappeared. They had one chance to bring her back. "The temporal window will open in 30 minutes, Ta-hyun said, checking their calculations one final time. "If Hei-yun is not in the exact right location when it opens, we might lose our only opportunity." They sent their final message to Hei-yun's tablet, giving her precise instructions about where to stand and when. The timing had to be perfect. In Roman Britain, Hei-yun read the message with mixed emotions. The flood waters were receding, and her warning had saved many lives. The fortress still stood proud, and its people had survived, just as history recorded. She had found a way to help without changing the major course of events. Claudia helped her prepare for departure, though Hei-yun had only told her she was returning to her homeland. They stood in Hei-yun's room, saying their goodbyes. "You have been more than a friend," Claudia said in Latin, holding back tears. You have been a sister to me. Hei-yun hugged her friend tightly. I will never forget you, she promised. Keep the medicine book I wrote for you. Use it to help others. Marcus Flavius waited at the fortress gate to bid her farewell. The gods brought you to us for a reason, he said. You have brought much wisdom to Legentium. Hei-yun smiled, knowing that the simple improvements she had shared, better sanitation, basic medical care, improved building techniques, would help the community thrive without drastically changing history. As the appointed time approached, Hei-yun walked to the spot where she had first appeared. She wore her shimmering rain jacket again, and her tablet was safely in her backpack. The sky grew dark with familiar storm clouds. In the modern laboratory, Professor Park initiated the temporal rain sequence. The machine hummed to life, creating the exact conditions needed to open a passage through time. The rain began to fall in both times, creating a bridge across nearly 2,000 years. Hei-yun felt the familiar tingling sensation as the temporal raindrops touched her skin. The world began to spin around her, but this time she was ready for it. When the spinning stopped, she found herself standing in Professor Park's laboratory. Tears of joy ran down her face as she hugged her mentor and friend. Welcome back, Jai-won said softly. Did you change history? Hei-yun smiled, taking out her tablet. No, I helped preserve it. Everything I read about Roman Legentium mentioned how well built it was, how it survived great floods and threats. Now we know why. In the following weeks, Hei-yun worked with Professor Park and Dr. Kim to document everything she had learned. Her detailed records and observations would help historians better understand daily life in Roman Britain. But sometimes, on rainy nights, she would think about Claudia, Marcus, and all the others she had left behind. She knew that somewhere in the layers of time, her friends were living their lives, making their own history, and remembering the strange visitor who came to them in the rain. The end.